This is the lecture for European history for Thursday, the 2nd of December, 2021. We have charted the different courses of English and French history roughly during the 800 period between the end of the beginning of the second millennium, which is around the year 1000, and the year 1800, which is roughly just after the French Revolution, or just around the time of the French Revolution. And the broad trends are that royal power declines in England to the benefit of the talky place of Parliament, comprising the House of Lords and the House of Commons assembled, to the benefit of the middle class, who are skilled people of property, lawyers, doctors, architects, so forth, bankers. And this produces a religiously heterodox society with Anglicans, yes, being preferred, Catholics, yes, being persecuted, but with Anglicans, Catholics, Puritans, and others. Establishment philosophy becomes more and more the philosophy of Parliament, establishment. Enlightenment philosophy becomes more and more the philosophy of Parliament. We're going to be talking about Enlightenment philosophy today. All of this produces a growing middle class and a constitutional monarchy, where you have a king, but you also have the king's power restrained and balanced off by the powers of Parliament. What all of this means is that while Napoleon may decry England as a mere nation of shopkeepers, those shopkeepers individually produce more wealth than any analogous group of Frenchmen. And those shopkeepers care mightily about their own freedom, care enough to fight for it, to work for it, to sacrifice for it. Whereas in France, a weak monarchy grows stronger and stronger. From the time of the Avignon papacy, the French kings begin to grab more and more and more power, at the expense of the aristocracy, at the expense of the cities, at the expense of their own middle class, at the expense of religious diversity. Where Louis XIV, at the Edict of Fontainebleau, revokes the Edict of Nantes and revokes religious toleration, causing the Huguenots to leave. Its alliance with a single church, whatever you may think of the Roman Catholic Church, the fact that it comprises 1/3 of l'État général, the Estates General, the French Parliament, the fact that the monarchy and the French Church is unified, means that the king's power is even more acute, because the church within France is going to conform itself to royal decree, to royal edict, not fight it. This leads to absolutist philosophy winning the day, and an absolutist monarchy, where the middle class shrinks and the lower class grows. All to feed the power of an insatiable monarchy, which ultimately ends up turning many of its kings, like Louis XVI, into mere pawns of a dead hand system, a system that extends and casts a shadow over the living. When you talk about the dead hand of history or the dead hand of tradition, you're talking about the downside of tradition. You're talking about people living in a completely meaningless way, living inauthentically according to ceremonial standards rather than objective standards, living to fulfill somebody else's dream rather than pursuing their own. Now, this absolutist power grab, I've been trying to say, does not come from the European tradition. It comes from a, frankly, misunderstanding of the Asiatic tradition of China and Japan, and it also is at absolute variance with the Judeo-Christian notions of individual conscience and the European medieval tradition of a competition between an independent religious organization, the church, and royal governments, where nobody gets total power, nobody gets absolute power. Neither emperor nor pope was the master of reality. But in the space of 100 years of the end of the religious wars at the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, monarchs, 100 years, from the mid-1600s to the mid-1700s, monarchs achieve a degree of authority and power unprecedented. And what that means is that the Europeans who used to see themselves in places like England and in Germany and elsewhere as free men under their king, to an American, that notion seems contradictory. How can you be a free man and still be under a monarch? This comes from the old Germanic and Gothic traditions that defeated the Western Roman Empire. I carry a spear. I carry it for my king, because my king protects my rights as a man, because my king protects my lifestyle, my culture. I am loyal to my king because he is loyal to me. That idea that a free man can willingly dedicate himself to a royal power is being crushed underfoot by the philosophy of absolutism, where you actually have King James I of England say that kings are gods, which is deeply at variance with the Christian tradition that says that Christ is the only king. So an independent philosophy, actually several different philosophies, rise up in opposition to this idea of absolutism. And there are four philosophers who we're going to focus on from this Enlightenment movement. But it's much bigger than these four. The Enlightenment ends up taking the place or joining with an independent spiritual authority in opposition to the political power in the country. Instead of simply rolling over slavishly and complying with royal edict, Europeans are stepping up and saying no. And this is why no. And we cannot say yes, because to say yes is to deny our very identity. No to absolutism. No to this total power that the kings are arrogating unto themselves. No. Won't do it, can't do it, shouldn't do it. We start out with Thomas Hobbes. Now, in your notepad, there's a picture from his book, Leviathan. It is near the end, I think. Maybe not that near the end. It's a picture near your maps. Aha! It's right near the revolutionary calendar of France. It looks like this. Picture. You're almost there, David. Next page. There you go. This picture. And this picture actually sums up, very good, Hobbes's notions. Thomas Hobbes, who survives the various stages of the English Civil War, like so many others, is shaped by the suffering caused in those wars. Hobbes famously says that life is short, mean, and brutal. That human life is fundamentally short, mean, and brutal. And by mean, I mean petty. He meant petty. It is short, it is petty, it is brutal. This notion that humanity lives in this world like angels, or Hobbes says no. In a state of nature, Humans are savage. Humans are murderous, thieving, raping, burning brutes. In a state of nature, we are vulnerable to the worst impulses that are inside all of us. And those terrible impulses, the dark side of our nature, the beast in us, the demon in us, is going to come out in an endless anarchy, an orgy of violence and fury. The only salvation from the brutality of existence and the deep flaws within human nature is the state. The state, the government, the nation, the king. The nation is a body of people. Hobbes posits, if you look at the picture, you see this visualized. Imagine that Europe is covered by massive amoebic life forms. And those life forms are the different nations, the different tribes, the different peoples, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Russians, the Germans, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Slovenes, Croats, the Bosnians, the Greeks, even Turks, the Italians, the French, the Dutch, the Walloons, the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Finns, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Welsh, the Irish, the Scots, the English. And that each of these creatures, like an amoeba in 2 dimensions, on a scientific slide, is writhing and struggling and pushing against one another. And that's the history of Europe. If you were to take the borders of European countries, and I've seen videos that do this, and you would see the growth of nations as basically amoebas that tend to have some geographical basis, writhing and struggling with one another to consume one another or protect themselves from the amoebas around them. On the Great North European Plain, which is a geographical cause of so much blood and death, violence and history and glory, you have the French, the Dutch, the Belgians are a mix, the Germans, the Poles, the White Russians, the Russians, and all the others. And the borders of these countries are not natural. A river does not make a great border. It simply doesn't. Rivers are arteries of commerce. They're not like a mountain chain. France and Spain have had a very stable border for the last 1,000 years because the Pyrenees Mountains forms that natural border. Whereas Poland is in the middle of the Great North European Plain. And so Poland has actually been eaten by the amoebas of Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and later Nazi Germany and Russia on several occasions, to the point where it was not even in existence from the end of the Napoleonic Wars up through the end of the First World War, over a century. So these amoebas are the nations, composed not of cells, but of countless human beings. And for these leviathans, for these nations to function, they must have an effective central nervous system. They must have a brain. They must have the ability to command their various parts so that what they are and what they produce is more than the sum of their parts. The European nation state is a great leviathan, and it needs a central nervous system, and that is the government. And it needs a mind. That is the king. Hobbes argues that the royal governments of Europe, these great minds in command of the nervous systems that dictate the actions of their great Leviathan beings, is the only thing that separates us from a savagery where life is nothing but short, mean, and brutal. Do you have any questions about Hobbesian ideas? Because Hobbes is used to justify all forms of strong or authoritarian government. The notion of human nature that Hobbes arrives at is not from the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's self-generated by observation, as if Aristotelian philosophy, the idea of the basis of the scientific method. How do we understand human nature? Hobbes looks around. He looks at his own life. He looks at the lives of the Englishmen and others around him, and he comes to reasonable, logical conclusions. So it's not about an immortal soul. It's not about human nature. It's not about the Garden of Eden or the fall of man or original sin or any of that. If man is left alone, man is a beast. Human life is not worth living. Only with governance can we be saved. So this is Hobbes' idea, and remember that picture of the Leviathan. I've always found it creepy. I still do. I think I always will. Because there are people in this world, maybe even in this room, who believe that Hobbes is essentially right. And Hobbes is not wrong about everything. I'm not arguing he's wrong about everything, but I see in this image an essentially dehumanizing picture of human nature and of human society. But that's just my opinion. It doesn't really matter. Okay. John Locke. John Locke is my favorite Enlightenment philosopher. Yes?
Oh, I was actually going to ask about Hobbes.
Sure.
And when you were just saying, like, dehumanization,
yeah.
What do you mean by that? Like, when you look at what
okay. John Locke, I'm actually going to answer your question.
Okay.
But John Locke is my favorite Enlightenment philosopher. I like him far more than Hobbes, far more than Rousseau, far more than Voltaire. And John Locke's core notion, as expressed in his 2 treatises of government, is that human beings are created with certain inalienable rights. I'm going to answer this by talking about Locke. I hope you'll see it. If you don't at the end, please ask and I'll explain. Certain inalienable rights. It is self-evident that we are created with these rights because of the way human beings are built, because of our natures, and therefore, since we are created with a certain human nature that includes or implies inalienable rights, these are God-given. The source of these rights is not a human being who says, people ought to have this right. It's not a government that says, we have fought for this right. It is that we are self-evidently created by God with such rights as a natural part of us, as much as our nose, our head, our ears, our brain, our blood. We are imbued by these rights. It is self-evident by God. And if any of this sounds familiar, you're thinking of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, Jefferson writes. July 2nd, 1776, published July 4th, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are, and he goes on. So the source of these rights, as determined by observation and by reason, not by the Bible, not by Scripture, not by any religious dogma or tradition, but by observation, is that we were created with these rights. Now, what does inalienable mean? Well, the word alien is separate, outside. So when people come to this country without due process of law, they are illegal aliens. They are here against the laws of the United States, and they are not Americans. They are Auslanders. They are outsiders. They are aliens. When we talk about intelligent life from off the earth in science fiction or scientific ponderings, we use the term alien to describe a life form that may have originated on another world orbiting another star. To be alien is to be fundamentally different and outside the norm. So to say that these rights are inalienable means that you cannot separate them righteously from a person without a very extraordinary situation. You cannot this is inalienable. You should write it down if you're not going to just absorb this like a sponge. Inalienable. Inalienable. I-N-A-L-I-E-N-A-B-L-E. Inalienable. I-N-A-L-I-E-N-A-B-L-E. Means you cannot righteously separate these rights from a person except in extraordinary circumstances. You cannot righteously separate a person from these rights without exceptional or extraordinary circumstances. You cannot righteously separate a person from these rights without extraordinary circumstances. So Locke's assertion is that we are not reaching for something by saying that human beings should have these rights. If you look at the way our minds are built, our societies have evolved, you can see these rights at play. And these rights don't come from us. They come from God. They come from the Creator. What that means is that if God gives it, people cannot take it away, not without extraordinary circumstances. So the legitimacy of this claim is based on self-evident reason and a notion that we are supposed to be a certain way. Okay. What are these rights? Well, in the Declaration of Independence, which is written about 100 years later, about 80 years later, inspired by Locke, Jefferson says, here's the whole phrase, preamble, the beginning. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, life. We are born. God gave us that life. Not from Scripture, but it is self-evident. We are born. That is part of our nature. We come into the world. We then are alive. We exist. That life, which has been given to us by God and nature's God, is not ours to take. So Locke is in harmony with most human societies which say that murder is not acceptable. Remember, in the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments of Moses, the commandment, thou shalt not kill, was never seen by the ancient Hebrews or by most Jews or Christians throughout history as you shall not go to war. No. The ancient Israelites went to war a lot. And Christians have gone to war as much as anyone else in the world. Nor is it traditionally interpreted, thou shalt not kill does not necessarily mean thou shalt not execute criminals. If a person is found guilty of a death penalty offense, killing them, executing them, is not considered to be murder. So what do both of these things have in common? War and government execution of capital criminals. What do those two things have in common that distinguishes them from murder? It's a question. What makes execution and combat different from murder?
justification.
Go on, you say justification.
Like, in a certain circumstance, it's in a situation. But, like, I think John Locke talked about, like, human innocence and dignity. That all people have dignity and should be respected by their rights and rights. So, if they lose that dignity by doing something unjustifiable, they're justified others to react.
Indeed, there are certain things a person can do that will degrade that person. In the War on Terror, I've never stood with the U.S. Army code that says we shouldn't torture prisoners. They torture us, they behead us, they being Islamic terrorists. I have no problem with the idea of employing torture against them. However, I would never want our soldiers to do it. Such a job would be for our allies. The Saudis are very good at torture. Such a result also could be performed by our Central Intelligence Agency, our spy network. To ask everyday men who are soldiers to engage in torture is to dehumanize them, strip them of their humanity, and give them memories they will never recover from. So yes, part of it is that Locke would say that murder degrades the individual who does it. Yes?
Murder is also seemingly done for personal reasons, or and the execution of a criminal is more for the purpose of protecting a larger group of people rather than the individual.
You've got it. You've got the answer I'm looking for. Your answer is certainly not wrong. Your answer is actually elegant. But if I am a murderer, it is because I have personally made the decision to kill someone. On my own. Not allowed to do that. If I'm engaged in self-defense and I kill someone, that's a different story. But if I decide that I'm sick and tired of Pius competing with me for the shortest hair in the room, and I'm going to end this, that's wrong. I'm a murderer. That's wrong in every way. By the way, it's nice that you have the option to grow hair. I've lost that a long time ago, so enjoy it while you got it. The notion of war and execution is that you don't make that decision personally. The government does. And if you have a legitimate government, a government that has the moral right to rule, the government decides when the nation must be at war and when the nation is at peace, not you. The government decides what is, if anything is, a death penalty offense. So is murder one, first-degree murder, murder with premeditation, a death penalty offense. In some states of the United States it is. In other states it is not. In some states you can actually be guilty of murder one and get paroled at some point. You can actually get out of prison. I've never understood that, but I'm old-fashioned. The idea that an individual can choose to take a life has, certainly since the time of the Ten Commandments, been forbidden in our Judeo-Christian Western civilization. Government's different. And you'll find this prohibition of murder, or against murder, in almost every civilized place around the world. You cannot have cities where murder is just allowed. The cities will collapse, the economy will falter, nothing will work. So murder, life, that's the first one. We have an inalienable right to life. Person is born, they'll die. It's not that, the universe is, we have an inalienable right to life for a limited time. Liberty. Liberty is the source of the word liberal. In classical political terms, I, who am about as conservative as an American as you will ever meet, am a liberal, which seems strange, because in American politics, liberals are progressive, Democrat, parasocialists who want the government to fix all our problems. I'm not that. I'm against a lot of that. But that's because in the 1930s, President Roosevelt, when he was running to become president, determined that progressivism as a label had been destroyed by Prohibition. If you remember your American history, after World War I, the United States federal government forbade the consumption and sale of alcoholic beverages. No booze. No booze. And what this did is not produce a society without drunks. It produced a situation where most Americans became criminals. Because most Americans drank. And we're not going to stop drinking. In fact, what happens is that prohibition leads to the creation of American organized crime. Before Prohibition, the mafia was a neighborhood gang in Italian ghettos called the Black Hand. There was no such thing as large-scale American organized crime. But Prohibition created opportunities for illegal organizations to enrich themselves because so many Americans wanted alcohol against the law. And we have never gotten rid of the plague of organized crime. It is still with us. So Prohibition had made progressivism, which is a belief that government can solve your problems and yada, 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 a bad name. So Roosevelt and his team decide, we're going to call ourselves liberals. And we're going to call those people who had previously been called liberals, liberty-oriented, small government people like me, we're going to call them conservatives. I will call them you. Conservatives are, in European parlance, monarchists or papists. They're people who like the kings and the Pope. I like the Pope. I like the former Pope more than I like the current Pope, but I like the papacy. And I have no problem with royal government as long as I'm not under it. But I'm not that type of conservative. I am a liberal. I believe in liberty. And what liberty is freedom. Sir, and then if you had your hand.
One of the things that came from Prohibition was right after the soccer racing became a very big thing.
Because banjo music, car chases with the feds had been a feature of Prohibition. You needed drivers to carry the shine, that is moonshine, illegally produced alcohol, past the feds to the illegal markets in the cities.
And then suddenly, you don't need to do that anymore. You have a car that can go really fast.
Yeah, might as well just race it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
My great grandfather made whiskey during Prohibition in his basement, and after the Prohibition, he still made it, even though he technically didn't have a license, because people still wanted it.
Good. Look, my wife's grandfather, who's about probably the same age as this guy, made grappa, and grappa is an Italian liquor. And he would also, sell it to his neighbors. Now, I think that you were allowed to produce a certain amount of certain types of liquor under Prohibition, but not sell it. Have it for your own use. But whiskey was not one of those approved topics. Did you ever hear of the basement blowing up?
No,
Because making whiskey in a place like that is dangerous.
Actually, I think it was my great grandmother, after she was all grown up,
Mhm.
the house where he was making the whiskey, the basement still had some of the.
Well, that's cool. That's
I
really...
have no idea where it is though, but my mother says that she would deny her father making whiskey, but we all know he did because.
Hey, look, the 1930s was also the time of the Great Depression,
Yeah.
and if you have a skill that can earn your family money for food, you use it. And also, somebody like that is going to be careful, because drinking the wrongly produced alcohol will make you blind. Bathtub gin was especially notorious for this. You have a person making gin in their homes, in their bathtub, and they don't pay attention to the right proportions or whatever, and suddenly you end up with people drinking and going blind or dying. So, got to be careful. Apparently, he was careful because he had people wanting.
Yeah, he was very careful with it, and I don't know where he learned to honestly make the whiskey, because
It's a skill. Look, today you can go on the internet, you can go on YouTube and learn how to make shine. But actually, I wonder if you can. I don't know if it's still illegal. It may still be illegal to produce liquor without a license. It may not. I think there was some change in the laws when I was your age, and I don't remember it.
maybe certain types, but definitely not anything with the highest rate
Yeah.
of alcohol
Yeah.
in it.
So our neighbor made moonshine, and he came to our house and was like, "Do you have any liquor you don't want anymore? I'm making moonshine."
What? So he was converting old liquor to moonshine?
Yes.
No,
Why?
that's not what you do.
That's how he did it, I guess.
Oh God, that's cheating. You make moonshine out of potatoes or some other natural grain.
Yeah.
You distill raw materials into alcohol. You don't just go, oh God, that's funny. I wouldn't call it moonshine. It's like a proud Southerner would never call grilling barbecuing, because barbecuing involves a pit and cooking like pork for a day or more in certain special sauces. Throwing hot dogs and hamburgers on a backyard grill is not barbecue. So moonshine people I've encountered are very proud of what they mean by moonshine.
I know for a fact in a couple states, and moonshine and various other liquors related to it are it's illegal to make it without license.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure that's still true in Appalachia, where a lot of people still make moonshine, regardless of what the government says. Good conservatives, then. Anyway, liberty is the belief that human beings are capable of learning reason. In fact, I explain liberty in a three-part syllogism. That's an Aristotelian logic statement. So you don't have to write this down, but it might make more sense to you. What is liberty? Is liberty the ability to make love to anyone you want, regardless of what they want? No, that's not. That's rape. Is liberty the ability to see, want, take? No, that's theft. Is liberty the ability to shout fire in a crowded movie theater? No, that's murder. That's manslaughter. You're causing a panic where people will be crushed and stampeded. It's very, very bad. Are you allowed to drive a vehicle through a crowd of people in a parade? No, not liberty. Okay? Liberty is if then. If all human beings have are capable of reason, as Enlightenment philosophers say, if all human beings are capable of reason, as Enlightenment philosophers say, if all human beings are capable of learning reason, as Enlightenment philosophers say, and if all human beings are of priceless value, as Christianity says, and if all human beings are of priceless value, as Christianity says, if all human beings are of priceless value, as Christianity says. So, if all human beings can learn reason, as Enlightenment philosophers say, and if all human beings are of value, as Christianity says, then all human beings should be free to make the widest possible choices in their life. Then all human beings should be free to make the widest possible choices in their life. And all human beings should be free to make the widest possible choices in their life. If that. So, the presumption that a lot of authoritarian governments and old-style monarchies have is that common human beings are dumb and are fools and are not going to be capable of doing what is necessary to control themselves and be good citizens in a free society. They need to be ruled for the common good. No. Enlightenment philosophers say that every human being, given the opportunity, except people who are handicapped, can learn reason, can learn actions and consequences, how choices lead to predictable consequences. If all human beings have priceless value, what price do you put on a human being? In the Middle Ages, the German and Viking concept of Wehrgeld was that everyone had a blood price based on their position in society. If I killed a warrior, I'd have to pay a certain amount of gold to their family. If I killed his daughter, I'd have to pay a much lesser sum. If I killed a king and I could pay my way out of it, I'd have to pay a magnificent treasure to get away from being killed. Wehrgeld was a way to avoid blood feuds. Didn't always work, but everyone had a price. But Christianity says, and God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten Son to die that we might have eternal life. He didn't just die for the beautiful people. He died for everyone. Stupid, ugly, handicapped, prejudiced, everyone. At what price do you place on Christ's crucifixion? What price do you pay on the immortal soul that each of us are supposed to have? So we are not just ends. We are not just means to another person's end. We have value. And we are not just ignorant brutes. We can learn reason. If we can learn reason and we have value, we should be able to make important choices, like who we will marry, what we will do for a living, what kind of education will we pursue, where will we live, what do we stand for, how will we act politically, what is worth living for, dying for, even killing for, what is life about? The exploration of the question, what is the meaning of life, is really what freedom is for. To allow each of us to consider independently and individually what we might think the meaning of life is, without interference from a government telling us what it is. So Locke says life, liberty. But Locke, who Jefferson is quoting, also says property. Jefferson says the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke writes 100 or 80 years before, life, liberty, and property. So why does Jefferson mealy-mouth property into the pursuit of happiness? For what reason does Jefferson not just quote Locke purposefully and say life, liberty, and property? What is it that Jefferson is trying to deal with in 1776 that won't allow him to blatantly say property? If you're wrong, it's not a big deal. I appreciate the guess.
Would it be that at that point, I don't know how some they're slaves potentially at that time?
There were a lot of people who wanted to free the slaves.
Right.
In fact, Jefferson, who was a famous slave owner, wanted to free the slaves. In 1776, at the beginning of the war against England, Jefferson wanted to eliminate slavery. Now, if he wrote property, the Southern politicians who were his allies, but who believed and depended upon chattel slavery, could use his words, which are about the liberty of man, to justify the enslavement of man. Jefferson did not want that. So by saying the pursuit of happiness, Jefferson is not giving comfort to slave owners. Jefferson is not giving justification for the ownership of human beings. The pursuit of happiness, in fact, is something that no slave can do. Because slaves are property, they are tools, they are means to another person's end. For Jefferson to argue that the pursuit of happiness is a fundamental right, what he means is the ability to make important choices and experience the benefits or consequences of those choices. So now we get to it, and the Marxists absolutely hate this part. Why does John Locke assert that property is an inalienable human right? After all, 100 years later, or actually 200 years later, after Locke, you have Marx saying that property is theft and positing a society without property, where everything is held in common. First of all, basic human nature. If you ever doubt that property is a basic thing that all humans value, spend time around 2-year-olds. 2-year-olds have a deep understanding of property. Mine. Oh, that's so colorful. I love it. Mine. And you say, no, that's not yours. That's mine. Keep your grubby hands off of it. Keep your boy cooties off of it. I haven't had boy cooties for decades, but you get the idea. That's mine. No, that's mine. And you have kids. Blah, 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 blah. Stop! I don't care who it is. Yeah. Property is something that at a basic level we understand. You know why? Because we understand when somebody takes ours. We understand when somebody violates ours. Something else about property. It's fair. When you are given something, you rarely appreciate it. The first job I ever had was on a farm. Between my 7th and 8th grade year, I worked as a farmhand on a dairy farm in Connecticut. And it was the most physically difficult work I've ever done in my life. I came out of that job in good shape, able to hurl a 50-pound or greater bale of hay from the ground onto the top of a truck that's about 2 stories high. Because that was part of the job. When they were wet, I couldn't do it that high. And with the $1.50 an hour, which was a lousy wage even in 1978, with the $1.50 an hour that I earned from that job, I bought myself my own 10-speed speed bike at a time when 10-speed bikes were the thing. It was beige and brown, and it was tough, and it was mine. I earned that with sweat and some blood, and I treated that bike well for many, many years because I knew what had gone into getting it. It was my bike to do with as I chose. When you earn something, you put time, effort, sweat, blood into getting it. It's yours. You pay for it with all of that effort. It is fundamentally unfair to deprive a person of the fruits of their labors. The assertion of property rights that Locke talks about is the assertion of fairness. Labor should produce reward. Reward is property. If you take a person's property, you take their dignity. If you take a person's property, you strip them of the rewards of their labor. You're engaged in theft. So a human being, unless they are a thief, unless they are a criminal, should have their rights to the property that they have earned guaranteed by any good government. And a government that won't guarantee property rights is not a government worth being loyal to. So how do you lose these rights? Well, if you are a murderer, you get to lose your liberty. Maybe you get to lose your life if you get the death penalty. If not, you're in prison, hopefully for life, in a situation where you'll never get to eat steak again, where you'll never get to get properly clean again. You're in prison, and maybe the horrible kinds of prisons that exist in the United States, where you have no safety from other prisoners. You lose these fundamental rights, these inalienable God-given rights, only by breaking laws. Otherwise, you can't righteously take them from someone. So, Locke argues if you want to deprive me of my liberty, or my property, or my life, you better prove that I'm a danger to society, that I'm a criminal, that I have violated the law. And then you can take those things. But failing that, for you to take my life, take my freedom, or take my goods is a deeply immoral act. It's an antisocial act. It's the kind of act that makes freedom impossible. Life, liberty, and property. Hobbes did not agree. Locke came after Hobbes, but Locke had experienced a lot of the things Hobbes had. Locke just came to very different conclusions. Instead of saying life is short, mean, and brutal, people need to be ruled for their own good, Locke is saying, no, people can learn reason, life, liberty, and property.
So then Hobbes wanted a really strong, controlling government?
Yes. In effect, that's what the Leviathan was. A government that would control people, and in doing so would control their baser instincts. Locke says that people can engage in the self-control if they're granted life, liberty, and property, and within limits. And if they violate those limits, then they lose them. Okay? Any other questions, comments, or thoughts? We'll continue with Rousseau tomorrow. By the way, Maren, did you do your case study on Locke, or have you just read Locke?
Oh, no, I had to study Locke in class.
Okay.
So I took a bunch of research on it.
Do you have anything to add? Or do you have any different interpretations of what I've said?
I think that Locke believes in a lot of individualism, so it
Dignity of the individual. Okay, then we are done. You may talk quietly in your seats until we dismiss.